Good evening, my washers and dryers, and welcome back to The Laundromat. Welcome back to Thicc Nonficc. This is episode 3 of a 4-part series. If you haven't seen parts 1 or 2, those are linked down below. And for Thicc Nonficc 2022, we have been reading Phenomena by Annie Jacobson, which is all about the US government's secret experiments into ESP and other psychic phenomena, hence the title. I am late filming this. I'm very late filming this because I wasn't sure if I wanted to. Part 3, which is what we're going to talk about today, the Defense Department years, is a very long part. There are like 9 chapters to it, and I don't think either of us wants to sit through me talking about it chapter by chapter for like 40 minutes. So I have a different strategy that I want to take, but first we are going to do another psychic experiment about remote viewing. So the way remote viewing works, we talked a little bit about it in part 2. But basically the idea is a psychic is in an undisclosed location, usually a submarine or a laboratory, and then there are scientists who have 6 envelopes. The psychic also has 6 envelopes, and in those envelopes are 6 locations that the science team will drive to, and the psychic is supposed to guess where that person is. We're not doing psychic things with where I live. And I can't really drive to a location. Here's what we're gonna do instead. On my wall, I have dozens of postcards from various places all over the world. And so from those, I have 6 that I will choose from, and I will let you guess where that postcard is from. Now, obviously, the psychic in the original remote viewing experiments had a bit of an advantage, as they knew the location had to be within a feasible driving distance from a starting location for the experiment to work. And as a result, I will let you know that these are tourist attractions. These are major cities across the world. There are some obscure ones, but I think if you know me or are related to me, you still have a decent shot of guessing it. And really, you have a decent shot of guessing. Like I said, there are 6. I will choose one, and that will be the one that you guess. And if you have psychic abilities, congratulations. As mentioned in the previous part, it is a 1 out of 6, which isn't the worst odds. But if you're guessing from kind of a blind list of tourist traps, could be fun. Let me know how you do. And let's get into part 3 of Phenomena. As I mentioned, I had a hard time figuring out how I wanted to convey this because my notes are extremely sparse. By the time I had gotten to this point in the book, it started to feel like a chore to read, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, not in the sense that like the book is difficult to read, but in the sense that I myself did not want to read anymore. So my notes are extremely sparse, but I have 2 major things that I want to talk about in the context of part 3. And the first part will be of a figure that we learn about in the context of the China side of all of this. China throws its hat into the ring of psychic warfare. And I met an interesting figure in that chapter that I really want to talk about because I had never heard about this guy before. And he's really interesting, and there's really only like 1 other biography that I could find about him anywhere. And I wanted to talk about what we learn about him in this chapter. But also the second thing is, this part by and large is the find out to parts 1 and 2's fool around, we'll say. And so we finally get to see these psychic abilities kind of put to the test with real world consequences on the line. And so I really wanted to talk about a couple of those instances, and also just some weird quirks and history facts that I learned over the course of this. So rather than going chapter by chapter, this video will more be a holistic look at this part. So for starters, we are going to be talking about a guy named H.S. Xian. There was an article that came out in 1979 that talked about this kid who could like see with his ears, in the sense that he could get more information just from hearing something than the average person could get by just hearing things normally. So this kid could hear something and know way more than you would think you could gather from like hearing. Like this kid was rolling insight when most people would be rolling perception. At the time, people didn't really pay attention to China in the Cold War in the same way that they were paying attention to Russia. And so when this article hit in 1979, it was kind of like a wake-up call of, oh, we should have been taking China seriously too. Basically, the chapter kind of goes into the idea of Qi, and Qigong is kind of what the name of the chapter is. And when the Great Leap Forward happened, they were willing to let Qigong be kind of a practice that was accepted. But from 1962 to 1978, it was like a dead zone. No one talked about Qigong in China from 1962 to 1978. And not a word was said about it until that 1979 article. And that was like a big wake-up call of like, oh, we should have been looking into this a lot. And as part of the Great Leap Forward, China's minister singled out Qigong for praise, citing its contribution to disease prevention. The Great Leap Forward was not a great time from what I understand. And so Qigong was still upheld by the party as like a way to distract people from the fact that they were starving and dying in droves. But as the CIA started digging into, okay, what is Qigong? Why is China obsessed with it? What can we learn about it? As the CIA started digging into this, trying to figure out who was responsible for the rise and acceptance of Qigong or of extraordinary human body function, which was kind of just like to push the human body beyond its limits. At the center of this was a guy named Chen Hussein, or as he was known in America, H.S. Tsien. Chen Hussein was born in China in 1911, and he left for the United States when he was about 14 after the Boxer Rebellion. He left, in fact, on a Boxer Rebellion scholarship, and he went to MIT, he went to the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech, and he studied under big-name aerospace engineers, guys like Theodore von Karman. And he worked in the jet propulsion lab. He was good at what he did. His professor, von Karman, declared him an undisputed genius. H.S. Tsien was also given permission to work on the Manhattan Project. He was granted the highest security clearance in order to do that. He was commissioned as a colonel in the U.S. Air Force, and he applied to become a U.S. citizen, but the paperwork lapsed. There was no follow-up. So, when Mao Zedong in 1949 declares the People's Republic of China is now a country, China and the US became enemies, and it became a really sucky time to be a Chinese national living in the US. It was the McCarthy era by that point, and in 1950, he had people banging on his doors, demanding to know if he had communist ties. And he's like, my guys, I worked on the Manhattan Project. I had literally like the highest security clearance possible. He tried to leave. They didn't let him leave. FBI revoked all of his covered clearances, and they put him on house arrest. He was on house arrest for like 5 years. He was deported to China as part of a Korean prisoner of war exchange. And look, I'm American. I've lived in America my whole life. I kind of don't blame him for what he does next. Like it's not great, but I also see where he's coming from, you know? Because when he got to China, he's like, okay, you see me as an enemy of America despite the fact that I have spent my entire adult life working for you. Okay, fine. And it says he spent the rest of his life avenging his treatment by the United States. I get it. He was able to kind of like change gears and focus on revenge, and science was the way he was going to do that. He was very instrumental in bringing China's technological position in the world up to speed. He worked and developed the Chinese rocket program, and he also worked on the Chinese atomic bomb project because he'd done it once. When he returned to China in 1955, he did have a lot of work to do in order to kind of bring it up to speed as part of a technological Great Leap Forward, so to speak. But he was deeply invested in continuing the work he did with stuff like rockets and mechanics, and so he was willing to do it just for China instead. Now, as part of the Great Leap Forward, Mao instituted a policy called Let 100 Flowers Bloom. And the whole point of this policy was to allow anyone to say anything about the Communist Party, and it would be cool. Just speak your mind. We're all friends here. It was a trap. And H.S. Tsien saw through that trap immediately. He's like, this is McCarthyism, but in China. And I'm just gonna shut my mouth and keep my head down and focus on this. Yeah, he was right. It was an excuse to purge the Communist Party in China, and hundreds of thousands of critics were punished, tortured, or killed. Because he kept his head down, put on the gray uniform, and just kind of did his work, It was seen as extremely loyal to the party, and he was rewarded for that. And he was promoted to director of the Fifth Academy, where he led China's top secret missile program. In October of 1966, China became the first nation to deploy a missile with a live atomic warhead in the nose cone. This was seen as reckless, but the New York Times did note that the guy who was responsible for this whole thing was nurtured and trained by the US. Not great that he tried to get revenge, but would have been better if he never had to, seek revenge in the first place. But yeah, so that's the story of Chen Husen. Very interesting. That's kind of a brief overview, the highlights. I would love to learn more about him. The other detail of part 2, as I mentioned, is for part 1 and part 2, we're kind of messing around with psychic capabilities, telepathy, all that jazz. But it's not until part 3 that we really get to see those put to the test. We see the tensions rise between the US and Russia. Dale Graff, a guy that we talked about in the previous part, was in Moscow while they were building the embassy. And a thing I didn't know about building embassies is, at least in the case of this one, the physical building and infrastructure is built by the country where that embassy will be. The interior, all of the wallpaper, kind of guts of the house, all the finish work, that is done by the country that will be occupying said embassy. Places where bugging devices were traditionally hidden, because there was no guarantee that the psychic abilities would be able to work more effectively than bugging. We encounter a situation where bugging would have been really helpful, but they tried to use psychics to figure it out. And that's chapter 16, Killers and Kidnappers. Which, that chapter opens with the fact that, people were just getting kidnapped left and right in the 80s. It's no big deal. People are just getting kidnapped. There was a guy named Gary Langford who was a remote viewer, and he predicted that a high-ranking Pentagon official would be kidnapped by terrorists on December 17th, 1981. It was so specific, and they ran multiple tests to confirm that this was not just a fluke or someone just saying something to say something. And he was right. Brigadier General James L. Dozier, who was a senior army official, was in Padua. He was staying at his penthouse in Padua with his wife, and the doorbell rang. And he goes to answer the door, and it's a bunch of guys from this paramilitary group called the Red Brigades. They come posed as plumbers coming to fix a leak, and they kidnap him. And now they're going to try to use remote viewing to find him. And they bring in Dale Graff again to try and help with this, and they have another guy named Joe McMonigal and Hartley Trent. And McMonigal and Trent were both helpful. They were able to use remote viewing to find the Typhoon, which was a Russian submarine. It is the submarine that they're looking for in Hunt for the Red October, the Tom Clancy novel. And between Langford and McMonigal, and even Graff tries some remote viewing himself, they are trying to find where he is with remote viewing. And the pressure keeps mounting as they go longer and longer, and Dozier still hasn't been found, and his abduction eventually reaches the 30-day mark, and they're like, this is bad. Graff says that it was a life or death situation, but in a dream state I began to get impressions. And for him, it was almost like the remote viewing sessions were just being conducted by himself in his home, rather than, trying to do it in a laboratory setting. He wrote up all of the experiences and he gives them to the authorities without mentioning that it's him. He didn't necessarily want his name to be on it. And so they take this information and they're able to capture the group. They're able to find Dozier before they could kill him. The text even says, Red Brigades member Antonio Savasta was holding a gun to General Dozier's head, but before Savasta could pull the trigger, a commando hit him from behind with the butt of a machine gun, knocking him to the floor. It gets to be a really sticky thing, this whole concept of remote viewing, because yes, Gary Langford made the prediction that he would be kidnapped. And yes, technically they were able to use remote viewing to track him down and find him. It was the same old question again. How does one discern what is signal and what is noise? Yes, Gary Langford's precognitive information was remarkable after it became a fact. But what good did it do? It neither stopped the kidnapping, nor did it help locate Dozier once he'd been taken hostage. And that is kind of the crux of part 3. Once the Defense Department kind of gets a hold of this shiny toy that the CIA has been working on for the past decade, 2 decades, They look at it and they look at its applications and they're like, that's nice. When you give a prediction and you are looking for that prediction to come true, by the time the thing happens, it feels less like the prediction has come true and more just like confirmation bias. And this whole part really has been kind of a shattering of like, oh, yeah, maybe it's not real, I don't know. But even if it's not real, that doesn't stop people from using astrology, remote viewing, psychics to make decisions, including President Ronald Reagan. According to Donald T. Reagan, which sounds like the fakest name in this context. It sounds like Ronald Reagan in disguise. But Donald T. Reagan, who was a former White House chief of staff, he revealed in his memoir that both President Reagan and Nancy Reagan sought the advice of private astrologers during his tenure at the White House. Reagan, that's R-E-G-A-N, not R-E-A-G-A-N, says, virtually every major move and decision that the Reagans made during my time as White House Chief of Staff was cleared by a woman in San Francisco who drew up horoscopes to make certain that the planets were in favorable alignment for the enterprise. I'm honestly not surprised that Nancy Reagan was really into astrology, but it is surprising to me that Ronald Reagan consulted with an astrologer. I never would have guessed that. That was the other fun fact of this chapter that I wanted to bring up, because that threw me through a loop and it made me laugh out loud. And hey, if Ronald Reagan could continue to use astrologers, remote viewers, whatever, the CIA could certainly keep using them too. And if they couldn't use them in war and saving hostages, they could definitely use them with drugs. Remote viewers were brought on to help interdict cocaine coming into the United States from South America. They wanted to see into the cargo holds of huge vessels and pinpoint exactly where drugs were being stored. Now, whether that was for the CIA to use it themselves, hard to say. Maybe it wasn't for the whole government, but certain pockets of the government were down to do it. And between March 1989 and March 1990, remote viewers conducted 982 counter-narcotic sessions, 565 were training sessions, and 417 were operational. Declassified documents reveal the number of search projects of intelligence value to have been 52%, while 47% were being listed as of no value. Win some, lose some, almost a 50-50 split. By the time we enter the 1990s, this whole thing is kind of a wash. We're not really using it anymore. And we get into the early 90s, and Dale Graff, who had incidentally and accidentally kind of become in charge of all that, he retired, and the efforts he put into keeping this project and program alive were very instrumental, because by the time he left, it says he was kind of leaving a sinking ship. It all kind of fell apart, and Andrzej Puharich, the first guy we met, he ended up passing away in 1995, pretty much broke. He was under threat of eviction, and so the whole concept of using psychic abilities, it kind of goes out with a whimper instead of a bang. And for such an exciting start that had so much promise and potential and excitement, it's really hard to see it all kind of like fall apart when it's really put to the test. But even if we don't have psychic abilities, I think a lot of us could have seen that coming. That wraps up part 3. Like I said, I wanted to do a different format for this because I wanted to focus on what I was really excited about rather than giving a rote recap. And while this video is still long, I think it's going to be better overall for all of us. So that's where that is. And I'll do part 4 that will come out hopefully pretty soon, and in the part 4 I will suggest a lot of books that I think will accompany this topic very well. And I think if you want to learn more and you've already read Phenomena, or you want to read Phenomena and then something else, those would be the books that I would recommend, and I'll talk about that more in the next part. But as a reminder, I have picked out a location on my wall. It is a tourist spot. Use your psychic abilities to figure out where the postcard is from. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you are having a lovely evening, and I will see you all next time.